But we're going to start tonight with this late-breaking news. So here's a little window into my workday. The whole staff is working away today. You know, the cubicle farm is really humming. People are in and out of everybody's offices. Like, we know what we're doing. We're working on the show. I'm in my office, threatening to be buried under teetering piles of paper, as usual. We're all working away like we usually do. And by this point, by almost 6 months into the Trump administration, we as a staff are now used to big stories about the Trump administration breaking late in the day, and then we have to throw our plans out the window and start to cover instead whatever the new bombshell is. We're used to that. But even with the fact that we are used to that timing now and to stuff breaking late in the day, when these headlines pop tonight, when this story first crossed, Trump-Putin held a second undisclosed meeting at the G20 summit. When these headlines started to cross tonight in our newsroom, it caused an audible, oh my God, to ripple across our cubicle farm. Oh my God, seriously? And I guess we should not be surprised anymore, right? We should have expected something like this, but still, this is remarkable news. And this is about, of course, the G20 meeting that took place a week and a half ago in Germany. We had known heading into that meeting that it would be the first face-to-face, one-on-one contact between Donald Trump as president of the United States and Vladimir Putin as president of Russia. That meeting that we knew about in advance, that ended up being itself pretty unusual. That meeting between Trump and Putin, it was on the schedule for 30 minutes. It went on for more than 2 hours. And then after that unusually long meeting was over, the Russians held an on-camera briefing for the press about what happened in that meeting, while the United States did not do that. Now, the Russians briefing the press after the meeting and the Americans not briefing the press, Foreign Policy magazine described that as, quote, ceding to Moscow the narrative about what happened behind closed doors. So the official meeting, that was, you know, it was unusually long, more than 4 times its scheduled length. That meeting that happened between Trump and Putin on Friday, it ended with just the Russians briefing the press on what happened. But now, on top of that, we are learning that there was a second meeting at that same event. And, you know, the first peep about this as a possibility had actually been the day after the meeting, the Saturday after. At the end of the story that they reported on the G20 that day, BuzzFeed News mentioned in their article about the G20 that they had heard from a single source that there might have been an additional long chat between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that hadn't been disclosed by the White House. But now, today, it has broken wide open. Ian Bremmer has confirmed the news, citing multiple sources. And wait till you hear him describe his sources. But he's reporting that, in fact, in addition to that formal meeting that went on for 2 hours, even though it was only scheduled for half an hour, Trump and Putin then, thereafter, had a second long meeting later that night that took place over the course of about an hour. And in what's being described as a fairly significant breach of national security norms and protocols, it was apparently only Vladimir Putin's translator who was present for and participating in that meeting. In the discussions between Trump and Putin, there was just the Russian translator. There was no American translator, nor were there any other American staff members who were taking part in those discussions. And that is a very unusual thing. And then there's the fact that the White House didn't tell anybody that this second meeting happened, right? You have to imagine, put yourself in the shoes of anybody who works at the White House. You have to imagine if there's one thing this White House might be aware of by now, it's that undisclosed contacts between Americans associated with Donald Trump and Russian officials, particularly at the highest levels. That's something that is of intense interest in this country. But still, the White House never mentioned it. They never mentioned that there had been this second long meeting until Ian Bremmer broke the news, and then the White House belatedly confirmed it tonight. Joining us now is Ian Bremmer. He's the president of the Eurasia Group, who brought this news to national attention. Mr. Bremmer, I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you for being here.
Sure, Rachel, my pleasure.
So for folks watching you tonight, wondering who you are and wondering what the Eurasia Group is, can you just give us a little bit of an introduction as to who you are?
Sure. I'm a political scientist. I got my PhD at Stanford over 20 years ago now, so I'm getting a little gray. And it is the world's largest political risk consultancy. So it's a company of political scientists look at how politics affect markets all over the world.
Okay, political risk consultancy. How did you come to know about this second meeting between President Trump and President Putin that the White House had never discussed?
Well, look, I don't want to tell you who directly told me, but this is a meeting of the principals, so it's the G20 heads of state and their spouses. Most of them were in attendance. It was a very long dinner, about 3.5 hours. I know a lot of the people in that group, and many of them, including all of America's principal allies, they found it remarkable. They were concerned by it. It was noteworthy, and so it got out. And I personally was quite surprised that there was no readout on it whatsoever after the meeting happened. And so as a consequence, I felt like this, especially because Trump himself, and there has been so much talk about what was and what was not discussed in the broader formal meeting, that 2-hour meeting that you just spoke about. Did they talk about sanctions? Did they talk about the hacks? Did he push them? Did they not? Ukraine, all of that. Well, I mean, none of that really matters if they then had an hour one-on-one at the dinner with only the Russian translator. We have no idea what was in that conversation.
Now, when you describe that as a one-on-one, while you're talking to me, we're showing some pictures that we've got from the dinner. Should we think of this second meeting that you're describing as being something where they were separate and apart from everybody else at the dinner? Were other people in a position where they could overhear what was being said?
So I don't know if we should call it a meeting. What we should do is say it's a dinner. The dinner was 3.5 hours long, very long. Not everyone that was supposed to attend actually showed up. There were a number of empty seats. And about halfway through the dinner, Trump gets up, goes around the table, sits down next to Putin, and begins this conversation. Everyone that was there, this was in full view of all of these heads of state and their spouses, and it was very animated. It was extremely friendly. There was certainly a lot of hand motion going on between the two leaders, the two presidents, but no one knows what they were out of earshot. So, I mean, unless the Russian translator has a tape, and I think there's a probably reasonably likelihood that he does, then, nobody else is going to have a readout of this meeting.
How unusual, on that point of the translator, how unusual is it for the President of the United States to have a one-on-one lengthy discussion with a foreign head of state using only that country's translator with no American translator participating in the discussion?
Apparently President Nixon used to do it because he didn't really trust the State Department at that point providing the translators, and didn't necessarily want information getting out, leaking, that he would want to keep private.
Wow.
Interesting historical point. But I mean, given how unusual the Trump-Putin relationship has been, how notably and consistently warmly both of these leaders have taken every opportunity to be towards each other, both publicly and, as we see, privately, the fact that you would have this kind of a meeting in front of all of these leaders, the first G20 summit that Trump himself had attended, with American allies already unnerved that their relationship, their private bilaterals, their phone calls with President Trump leads them worrying, can we really count on the United States in terms of NATO, security, global trade, climate, values, you name it, to then show that by far his best personal relationship is actually with a country that many of them considered to be an antagonist, and at least until Trump became president, the United States did as well. That's exceptionally unusual. It's disconcerting for American allies around the world. And it's certainly, I mean, despite the fact that Trump apparently just tweeted that it's fake news, it's a real story.
Yeah. Well, anytime the president has just tweeted that something is fake news, we just consider that to be a day that ends in Y around here. One last quick question for you, Mr. Bremmer. That is, on that point of the White House not doing a readout of this, not explaining what happened in this discussion, it seems to me, just as a distant observer of these things, that the White House almost always does a readout of any discussion that the president president has with a foreign head of state, particularly if it's one that's not held, in secrecy, if it's held in full view of other people so they can tell that some discussion happened. Are you saying that too, the fact that there was no White House readout or discussion about what happened, that also is very unusual here?
I think it depends. I mean, certainly when you have meetings like this, big summits, it is not unusual for a couple of leaders with business to discuss to take each other aside, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that sort of thing. But I think both given the unusual nature of the Trump presidency, the uniquely unusual nature of the Trump-Putin relationship, and the length of this meeting that they chose not to disclose, given the controversy around the broader disclosed meeting, public meeting, as it were, this all strikes me as exceptionally unusual and something that is not going to go away anytime soon.
Ian Bremmer, who's the president of the Eurasia Group, which is a political risk consultancy, who brought this second Trump-Putin meeting to national attention tonight. Thank you for helping us understand it, sir. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, my pleasure, Rachel.
All right, thanks. Yeah, like I said, those news come across. Second undisclosed meeting between Trump and Putin. My office is like here, and my executive producer's office is like here, and then the other offices for everybody who works in the staff kind of splay around the corner like this. I heard it coming like the stadium wave made audible. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, did you see this? Oh my God, oh my God. Today's news. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.